"Don't touch her," the Mafia boss said, and the room fell silent. The silver charm chimed once against a steel shelf bracket, a small, bright sound swallowed almost instantly by the groan of a forklift somewhere down the row, and Rosa Moretti didn't stop counting. She had a rule about her hands. They did not shake, not for a jammed conveyor belt, not for a supervisor's temper, not for the men in tailored coats who occasionally toured the warehouse floor and treated the word please like a language they'd never learned. Her bracelet, the one with the tiny music box charm, caught the fluorescent light every time she moved a crate, and she moved constantly, checking manifests, correcting mislabeled pallets, keeping an eye on the new girl at receiving, who kept apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Near the loading dock, a broad man in a slate gray suit had his hand around that new girl's wrist, not gripping, not yet, just resting there with the casual weight of someone who had never once been told no. Rosa set her clipboard down without a sound. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that 3 of the men touring the warehouse that morning ran half the freight moving through the Chicago rail yards, or that the 4th had a reputation that made grown men reroute their whole week. She only knew the shape of a hand that didn't belong where it was. She walked toward the loading dock. Somewhere behind her, boots landed on concrete, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone standing who rarely needed to. What Rosa didn't know yet was that the charm on her wrist would chime like that one more time, months from now, in front of every dangerous man in this city, and that the second time, it would change everything. What would you have done, in her shoes, before you knew who was watching? Rosa Moretti ran her section of the warehouse like a woman conducting something. 12 bays, sometimes 18 during a rush, and she never needed the handheld scanner twice on the same pallet, because she carried the inventory the way she carried everything, in the part of her mind that never let people down. She noticed things. The forklift driver, Emile, whose steel-toed boots had a crack starting at the left seam that he covered with electrical tape. The regular delivery driver, who always arrived Tuesdays and always asked after her sister by name. The way certain visitors, the well-dressed ones, touring the facility for reasons no one below management level was told, looked past her when they asked a question, addressing the air just above her head, as if she were a fixture of the building rather than a person standing in front of them. A man in a cashmere coat did exactly that on a Wednesday morning. Asked about a shipment's arrival time to the air over her shoulder, then, when she confirmed the schedule correctly, said, to his companion and not to her, surprisingly competent for someone in her position. Rosa gave him the same flat, professional look she gave every clipboard discrepancy. She logged his shipment without a wasted motion. She did not let her face do anything her voice hadn't approved. She filed the comment away in the part of herself that never forgot, but also never let it slow her down, and she moved to the next bay, where a temp worker was struggling to strap down a pallet for its second inspection, and Rosa took the ratchet strap from his hands and cinched it in one practiced motion, and he exhaled with relief. And that was the whole exchange, and it was enough. She had raised her sister Mia alone since she was 22. She did it on this job, on double shifts and cold concrete under her boots, and the particular exhaustion of always being the strong one. And she never once described it to a coworker as a hardship, because it wasn't the sum of her. It was just the shape of her days. The warehouse was called Serena Logistics. Rosa had worked there 4 years before she learned, from an offhand remark by the shift manager, that it was quietly owned by the DeLuca family, the same name people said carefully, if they said it at all, the way you might mention weather that could turn. She hadn't thought much of it. Rich families owned things. It didn't touch her section. Until the morning the door at the back of the facility, the one that was always locked, always guarded, that led to the private inventory office on the mezzanine, opened for her for the first time, because someone up there needed a worker who wouldn't be afraid of who she was reporting to. The mezzanine office smelled like machine oil and old cardboard, and it was colder than the warehouse floor below, the kind of cold that came from a ventilation system built for men who never broke a sweat. 6 men sat around a long steel table with shipping manifests spread across it. Rosa recognized none of them, which was, she would later understand, exactly the point of being sent up. She delivered the manifest updates the way she delivered every report. Clipboard steady, eyes level, no tremor. When she reached the man at the head of the table, she didn't yet know his name was Alessandro De Luca. She only knew he hadn't looked up from the ledger in front of him, and that every other person in the room had gone quiet the second she walked in a way that had nothing to do with her. "You'll want to check Bay 9 before you sign off," she said to him, the same way she'd say it to anyone. "Manifest doesn't match the count." He looked up then. A thin scar crossed his right eyebrow, old and pale, and his eyes did the thing eyes do when they're recalibrating something. Every worker they sent up here addressed the room, not him. Waited for a cue. Rosa had simply corrected an error to the person responsible for it, the way you'd correct anyone's mistake. "Show me," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of calm that made the men beside him sit up straighter. She led him down to Bay 9 and pointed out the discrepancy. 12 crates logged, 11 crates present, and if she noticed that a man behind them exhaled like he'd been holding his breath, she didn't show it. It was Alessandro's defining wound, though no one in that warehouse would have called it that. He had built a decade of silence around himself, because gentleness, in his world, was a door enemies walked through. He had trained every person around him to read fear in his stillness. Rosa read nothing in it at all. She simply saw a man who needed an accurate count. Later that same visit, a small girl slipped past a guard who was supposed to be watching the mezzanine stairs. Mia dropped off after choir practice, wandering the loading floor looking for her sister. She marched straight to Alessandro, entirely unbothered by 6 men whose names alone closed streets, and said, with the total confidence of an 8-year-old, "You have Rosa's exact frown. She does that when she's thinking too hard, too." The bay went silent in a different way this time. Alessandro's mouth did something it rarely did, the beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile, gone before it fully arrived. "Does she?" he said. Rosa scooped Mia up with an apology already halfway out of her mouth, but Alessandro raised one hand, barely, and the apology died in her throat. "Let her stay a minute," he said. Not a request. Not quite an order either. Something Rosa didn't have a name for yet. He watched Mia climb onto an empty crate beside him, chattering about her choir teacher, and he watched Rosa watching her sister with an expression that had no calculation in it whatsoever. And something in him, quiet and old and long buried, made a decision. He didn't explain it. Not to his men, not to himself, and certainly not to her. What would you do if the most dangerous man in the room asked you to stay? It started with small things, the way most consequential things do. Alessandro requested the mezzanine inventory review every Thursday. He requested, without ever quite saying so, that Rosa be the one to walk him through it. He tipped no one. That wasn't how his world worked on the floor. But her schedule seemed to bend, gently, around his visits regardless. He learned her name was Rosa before she ever gave it to him. Someone must have told him, though she never found out who. He never used it in front of his men. He used it once, quietly, when she was clocking out for the night and he happened to be crossing the loading floor, and the single word landed like something private, something he hadn't planned to say out loud. The silver charm on her bracelet came from him, though she didn't know that at first. A small wrapped box left in her locker, no card, delivered the week after she'd found a De Luca family heirloom, a jeweled cufflink, unmistakably valuable, loose inside a crate during a routine inspection, and returned it without a word to anyone, without even mentioning it to Alessandro directly. She'd simply handed it to the shift manager and said, "Someone will want this back." She never asked for a reward. The box arrived anyway. Inside was the charm, a tiny silver music box, no bigger than a thumbnail, that chimed if you turned it. She wore it from then on, without knowing what it meant to give. He authorized a bonus for every guard on the property that quarter. He extended deference to every captain who visited, because deference kept the peace. He gave her nothing but his attention, undivided, unexplained, and entirely unlike anything he offered anyone else. One night she saw the cost of his world instead of its power. He came down to the loading floor alone, past midnight, and sat on an overturned pallet where Rosa was doing a final count before closing up. And he didn't speak for a long while. And when he finally did, it wasn't about anything that mattered. The weather, a joke about the shift manager's temper, small, human sentences from a man who spent his days being feared. She understood, without being told, that this loading dock was the only place in the city where he didn't have to perform anything. His men noticed her before they ever said anything about her. A guard named Salvo, built like a door frame, started holding the mezzanine door for her without comment. Another remembered her sister's name after hearing it exactly once and used it correctly months later. Small things. The kind of things men do when they've quietly decided someone matters, before their boss has said a word. It was around this time that Lorenzo Bellini began touring the warehouse regularly. He was warm where Alessandro was contained, quick to laugh, generous with compliments, the kind of man who remembered a worker's coffee order after one visit. He called Rosa the conscience of this whole operation, said it like praise, and she believed him, because there was no reason yet not to. Nobody on that floor, watching Lorenzo charm the room with his easy smile, could have guessed what he was already planning. Rosa felt it before she could name it, a wrongness in the air the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color, before the pressure drops. It was small at first. Lorenzo asked too many questions about Alessandro's schedule, phrased as friendly curiosity. Which shifts Rosa worked, which nights the mezzanine office ran late. He laughed it off as small talk when she hesitated. She mentioned it to Alessandro, carefully, because she still wasn't sure what she was allowed to notice in his world. Lorenzo's harmless, Alessandro said. Ambitious, not dangerous. He believed it when he said it, that was the trouble. His own flaw, the armor he'd built out of never showing what mattered to him, had made him blind to the fact that Lorenzo had been watching for months for exactly the thing Alessandro thought he was hiding. Rosa didn't argue, but she started watching Lorenzo the way she watched every mislabeled pallet, filing details away, saying nothing, letting her face show only what she chose. The rupture came on an ordinary Thursday. Alessandro canceled the mezzanine review without warning, a rare, unexplained absence, and word moved through the warehouse that there'd been trouble at the rail yards, a shipment gone missing, fingers already pointing. Rosa heard Lorenzo's name mentioned once, quietly, by a guard who didn't know she was listening, and then never mentioned again. That night, she made a choice that cost her something quiet but real. She stayed late, past her shift, and told Salvo what she'd overheard, not because she was certain of anything, only because staying silent had never once been in her nature, and this was not the moment to start. Salvo told her gently that she should let the De Lucas handle their own business. She clocked out anyway, unthanked, unsure if she'd done right or simply made herself a target for nothing. Alessandro, for his part, made his own quiet, telling choice. He doubled Rosa's usual escort home without asking her, without explaining why. And when Salvo mentioned this was unusual, Alessandro only said, "She's not to be alone in this city right now," and said nothing else. A sentence that told his men more about where his loyalty had settled than a speech ever could have. Neither of them knew, that night, that Lorenzo had already set the date. The warehouse the following week would be full. Every captain, every rival, every set of eyes that mattered in this city, gathered under one roof for a peace summit Lorenzo himself had proposed, held on neutral ground among the loading bays where no single family's territory could be claimed. Rosa would be working it. Neither of them could yet see how this ended. Rosa found it by accident, the way truth often arrives, sideways, disguised as something else. She was pulling a manifest in the small dispatch office off the loading floor, and Lorenzo's assistant had left a printed floor plan behind, along with a handwritten note that wasn't meant for anyone's eyes but Lorenzo's own. It listed her name, and beside it, a bay number that put her directly beside the guard station nearest Alessandro's usual position during the summit. Beside that, a single instruction, in a hand she recognized from 100 shipment approvals, make it visible. Everyone must see him choose. She read it twice. She did not run to Alessandro. She did not confront Lorenzo. She stood very still in the small dispatch office and thought, the way she'd thought through every hard shift of her life, methodically, without panic, cataloging what she knew. Lorenzo wasn't trying to hurt her for her own sake. He was trying to use her. to force Alessandro into a public choice between the reputation he'd spent a decade building and the one person who'd slipped past every wall he owned. If Alessandro stayed silent to protect his image, Lorenzo would call it proof the boss was weak enough to sacrifice anyone. If Alessandro spoke, Lorenzo would call it proof he could be controlled through something as ordinary as a warehouse worker. A lever, finally found, after years of searching for one. She understood, with a clarity that made her hands go very still, that Lorenzo had spent years watching men like Alessandro consolidate power nobody could question, and had grown to believe his own years of loyal service should have earned him more than he'd been given. It was almost, a reason she could have understood, in a different life, from a different man. That single flicker of something human in Lorenzo's plan didn't make it forgivable. It made it worse. A man who could still recognize what fairness looked like, and had chosen this path anyway. She thought of the charm at her wrist, the first gift Alessandro had ever quietly given anyone, the one currency he'd spent without calculation. She thought of the moment months ago when she'd simply told him to check Bay 9, before she knew there was a world in which that sentence mattered. She did not warn him and wait to be protected. She went to Salvo instead, and asked him one question. Which guard, out of everyone working the summit, answered first to Lorenzo, and not to the De Lucas? Salvo told her the name. Rosa nodded, and went back to checking manifests, and said nothing to anyone else, because she had already decided, quietly, what she would do when the moment came. The warehouse floor was full the night of the peace summit. Every captain from every family that mattered in Chicago, standing among the loading bays that had been cleared and lit for the occasion. Cold concrete underfoot, and the smell of machine oil still faint in the air beneath the cigar smoke. Rosa worked the floor exactly as she always did. Steady hands, sharp eyes, the same competence she'd carried since her first shift. When the guard Salvo had named reached for her wrist, grabbing it under the pretense of steering her out of the aisle, hard enough to matter, Rosa didn't freeze and she didn't wait. "You're not authorized to touch staff," she said, loud enough that the nearest captains turned, her voice flat and clear, no tremor in it at all. "Ask Lorenzo whose orders you're actually following tonight." The room's attention shifted before Alessandro had even moved from his position near the dispatch office. That was the point. She had made the trap visible on her own terms, before anyone else could name it for her. The charm on her bracelet chimed, small, bright, unmistakable in the sudden quiet, the sound carrying strangely far across the open concrete floor, as the guard's grip tightened for half a second longer than it should have. Alessandro crossed the warehouse. He didn't rush. He walked the way he walked every floor, unhurried, boots even on the concrete, and every man in every bay watched him do it, because they had spent years learning that Alessandro De Luca's calm was worse than another man's fury. He didn't touch the guard. He didn't need to. He looked at the hand still circling Rosa's wrist and said 4 words, quiet enough that the whole warehouse had to lean in to hear them over the hum of the overhead lights, which was exactly why they landed like a gunshot. "Don't touch her." The guard let go like he'd been burned. Lorenzo, standing near Bay 6, opened his mouth to salvage something, a joke, an excuse, anything, and found that no one around him was looking at him anymore. They were looking at Alessandro, and at the woman beside him whose hand he had just, without any planning at all, taken into his own. Pause here and ask yourself, how many rooms have you stood in, waiting for someone to finally say the thing everyone already knew? Salvo moved first, cutting off Lorenzo's exit toward the loading doors before the words, "This is a misunderstanding," had fully left his mouth. 2 other captains, sensing exactly which way the floor's loyalty had just turned, moved to block the remaining exits, not because Alessandro asked them to, but because Rosa's plain, unshaking accusation had already told them everything they needed to know about who'd been managing whom. Mia, who had once again slipped past a guard who should have been watching more closely, stood frozen near the dispatch office door, and it was her small voice that broke what was left of the silence. Rosa didn't do anything wrong. No one argued with her. No one ever did. Serena Logistics reopened for regular operations 3 days later, and Rosa worked her usual bays, because that was what she did. The world resumed, and she resumed with it. Lorenzo was not seen at the warehouse again. The details of that were not something anyone at Serena Logistics discussed above a whisper, and Rosa didn't ask. Alessandro came by on a Thursday, alone this time, and stood not in the mezzanine office but at Bay 9, the one reserved now, unofficially, for a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone watching. Rosa brought the manifest over herself. "Count still off?" she asked, exactly the way she'd asked the first time. "You already know it isn't," he said, and something in his face had loosened, permanently, in a way it hadn't before that night. She handed him the clipboard. Their hands brushed at its edge, briefly, and neither of them moved away first. Mia arrived 20 minutes later, dropped off after choir practice, and climbed onto an empty crate beside him without asking permission, the way she always did, and began telling him at length about a solo she'd nearly gotten. He listened to every word of it like it was the only conversation happening in the building. Rosa watched from across the floor, clipboard still in hand, and the silver charm at her wrist caught the fluorescent light exactly the way it had the very first morning. Except this time, nothing about that sound made anyone on the floor fall silent with fear. It simply chimed, small and clear, the sound of an ordinary bracelet on an ordinary shift, in a life she had built with her own two hands, and had no intention of surrendering to anyone. Have you ever been the only person in a room willing to say the uncomfortable thing out loud? Not because you were fearless, but because staying quiet felt worse than whatever came next. Rosa never set out to matter to a man like Alessandro De Luca. She simply refused to look away from someone being hurt, the way she'd refused her whole life, long before anyone powerful was watching. Maybe you've had a moment like that, small, unremarkable to everyone else, that turned out to be the hinge your whole life swung on. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper.